Hi everyone, Mr. Davis here. This is the third of our lessons on the musculoskeletal system. We're going to start off with a knowledge recall task looking at antagonistic muscle contraction. If you could just make sure you've got pen and paper to move through the rest of the lesson. And for these questions, please record an answer down on the paper without looking at previous notes. So have a good think, commit to an answer, and then we'll go through them shortly. Pause the video here while you work through those questions, and then we will go through the answers. So let's do these one at a time. Identify the agonist during shoulder flexion. So what does that movement look like? Maybe do it now. Try and get an idea of what the feeling is like, which muscles are working there. So the agonist during shoulder flexion. So shoulder flexion is bringing the arm up in front of you. The agonist is the one that's contracting, that's responsible for that movement. And the muscle there is the anterior deltoid, so the front deltoid. Got anterior deltoids at the front. Which ones move to the side of the arm? That would be your middle or medial deltoid. And then your posterior deltoid is at the back. So if you place your hand on the front of your shoulder, then bring that arm up in front of you, you should feel a contraction in your anterior or front deltoid. Number 2 is identify the antagonist during ankle plantar flexion. So remember plantar flexion, think of the P for pointing. So you're pointing your toes away. If you do that now, go up onto the balls of your feet. You're probably feeling your gastrocnemius, so your calf muscles contracting. The antagonist is the one that works in opposition to control and coordinate that movement. And that is the tibialis anterior. So there's muscles that run down the front of your shin. Number 3, identify the agonist during hip hyperextension. So again, what does that movement look and feel like? Hip flexion is moving the leg up in front of you, closing the angle of a joint. Hip extension is bringing it back down. Hip hyperextension is increasing that angle beyond 180 degrees. So as if you were preparing to kick a football, bring your leg even further back in preparation. And the muscles there that are working, responsible for that movement, are the gluteals. If you perform that movement now and put your hand on your backside, you will feel the contraction. Number 4, identify the antagonist during horizontal adduction of the shoulder. So that was a new one that we looked at yesterday, horizontal adduction. So if you move the arm up and out to the side, that movement, then when you move it across from the side to pointing those arms in front of you, so from the side and moving it across in front, that's what horizontal adduction is. The antagonist in that movement is the latissimus dorsi, because it's the pectorals that are contracting. The pectorals would be the agonist, the latissimus dorsi would be the antagonist. Number 5, the plane and axis involved in elbow flexion. Let's think of a sporting example. Just perform that movement now. Elbow flexion, for instance, in a bicep curl, movement in a forwards and backwards direction. That's the plane that's being moved through. As soon as you've established that, you can work out the pair. So forwards and backwards movement, you should know, is the first of the 3 pairs. Go through the rhyme. What's the rhyme? Silly teachers force students to learn. So silly teachers is the first in the pair, and that tells you it's the sagittal plane, transverse axes. And finally, number 6, identify the plane and axes involved in hip adduction. So hip adduction, what type of movement is that? Abduction is taken away. Hip adduction is movement towards the midline of the body. So if you're in a kind of a star shape and then you bring your hips and legs back in so your feet are together, that's hip adduction, movement towards the midline of the body. Okay, now as you move your legs either out to the left and then back in together again, that is movement to the side. So any sideways movement is the middle pair. So from there, you go back to the rhyme. Silly teachers force students, FS, frontal plane, sagittal axes. If any of that is confusing or you've got a lot of those questions wrong, I'd strongly advise you to go back over the previous presentation, go through that information again, looking very carefully at the agonist and antagonist for all of those different movements, but also touch base on the work from the early lessons on planes and axes as well, because it's so important that you get to grips with that. Okay, right, if you're happy with that and you've got the majority of those correct, make sure purple pen marking on all of those questions so you have the correct answer written down, and then we will move on. So movement analysis number 3, learning objective is to learn how different types of contractions are produced and apply this to sport and examples. So if you can make sure that you have the title neatly written and underlined at the top of the page, the learning objective written out in full, and then those keywords are actually the same as from the previous lesson. So I don't mind if you don't write them all out again, but do just take a moment to pause the video and read through them and make sure that you've got a basic understanding of each of those terms, because they're critical for what is about to follow. Okay, when you're ready, we will move on. So the first thing to note is that there's essentially two types of contractions that you can have. Isotonic contractions are where there's movement involved and therefore a change in muscle length. So most sporting actions are isotonic. There's movement involved in lots of different sports. As a result, it's a continuous change in muscle length. The opposite of that is an isometric contraction, where there's no movement. It's still a contraction of the muscles. So for instance, if you leant up against the wall and pushed against the wall really hard, that's quite hard work. Your muscles are working, but because you're not moving, there's no change in length of the muscles. Okay. Now, whether this would help or not, I always used to remember it through isotonic sports drinks. That used to be a thing. So things like Lucozade used to give you energy to move around. That energy for movement, isotonic, that's how I remembered the difference. Isotonic is movement with a change in length of muscle. Isometric, no movement, still a contraction, but no change in length of the muscles. Okay, make sure you've got that down and make sure that's crystal clear before we move on. So what we now need to do is establish some good sporting examples. So for example, isotonic examples, you could have something like the leg action when you're running. Now, I think it's better that you specify, the part of the body that's involved in the actual example that you're giving. So don't just say running, because running, while it might seem obvious that the legs are involved, potentially you're looking at other parts of the body as well. So the clearer you are with your examples, the better. So that's an example where there's obviously movement and therefore a change in muscle length. See if you can make a list of at least 4 or 5 other examples. Once you've done that, try and do the same thing for isometric, I'm supposed to say. So let's just correct that. Isometric, apologies. Isometric, so no movement, no change in muscle length. So for example, the arms when you're holding a plank position. So for instance, a standard plank, maybe if you did it in a press up position with your hands down, straight arms, and you just hold that position, that's quite hard work. Your muscles are contracting. Because there's no movement involved, there's no change in muscle length. As soon as you start moving, that then becomes isotonic. So again, pause the video here. I'd like at least 4 or 5 examples for isotonic sporting actions. And then if you can, try and think of 4 or 5 isometric examples as well, based on those key rules. Pause the video here to complete that task. And we'll go through a few examples. Now, there are lots, obviously, for isotonic, because any movement involved in sport is potentially isotonic. So some of the ones, just to add these to your list if you haven't got these included. So the legs when running, the arms during when pushing up during a press up. So when you've gone down and then you push up, that movement involves changes in muscle length. The arms when you're throwing something. So lots of sports involve throwing or passing or even dribbling. That movement involved in the arm during that action, there's a change in muscle length. Legs when you're jumping up. So from a stationary position, if you then push up to jump up to catch a rebound, jump up for a layup, jump up for a header, there's movement involved, so there's a change in muscle length. The arms and the legs when swimming. So swimming is one of those sports that involves a huge number of movements and a huge number of muscles. It's what some people consider to be like a whole body exercise. So everything's working. Arms and legs are both moving, so there's change in muscle length throughout that technique. Then if we come to the isometric examples, things like arms when holding a plank, arms when holding a crucifix position. So crucifix position is, if you think of the rings in gymnastics, and then you've got the gymnast here who's holding himself up in that sort of position. They've obviously had to move to get into that position, but then that position which is just held in a stationary or fixed stance, that's incredibly difficult. The muscles are working incredibly hard, but crucially, whilst there's no movement, there's no change in muscle length. As soon as there's movement, it becomes isotonic. The arms when holding a weight in a set position. So if you're doing weightlifting, for instance, if you lift the weight up above your head and then hold it, that's isometric. If you get halfway up a bicep curl, so the arms are the weight and the arms are parallel to the floor, just hold that position. That's very difficult. Your muscles are working. There's contraction there, but at that point where there's no movement, it's isometric. So there's no change in muscle length. Here's a series of other examples. What I want you to do is establish whether they are isotonic or isometric and add them to your list. Pause the video here, go through each of them carefully, and we'll establish which one's which shortly. Okay, so let's do top left first, the sprint in action. So let's go with the idea that they're coming up out of the blocks and they're into their sprint in action. Is that isotonic or isometric? Isotonic, because there's movement involved in a change in muscle length. You can see the muscles working here and here. There's a change in muscle length. Movement has to be isotonic. Tennis serve, obviously quite a dynamic, explosive technique. Movement involved has to be isotonic. High jump, movement involved has to be, change in muscle length has to be isotonic. This is essentially an even more advanced version of the crucifix, but the arm action remains the same. So it's stationary, no movement, no change in muscle length. Now in this middle one, in the scrum in rugby, at the very start of the scrum, where there's no movement, both teams are just pulling equally against each other, that would be isometric, because no one's moving. You're just holding it in that fixed position. As soon as one team gains an advantage and starts moving and then pulling the other team towards them, movement involved, and then that would become isotonic. But the initial part of it, a similar way to an arm wrestle. So at the very start of an arm wrestle, if you've got an arm wrestle with someone of similar strength, there's very little movement. It's right locked in at the top of that position. And that would be isometric, because there's no movement and therefore no change in muscle length. Kick in a football, movement involved, change in muscle length has to be isotonic. The scrum in rugby, so at the very start of it, even when that ball's gone into the middle, they're pushing each other and assuming there's no significant weight difference or strength difference. They go through a short period where there is very little movement, but they're working incredibly hard. Isometric, no movement, no change in muscle length, has to be isometric. Now this one's interesting. When you go through the start of a sprint race, you will hear them say, on your marks, get set, go. On your marks is quite a relaxed position. Get set is where you establish the position that the athlete's in here. It's not a comfortable position. They're leaning forward, They're holding that fixed position. It's not restful and relaxing. There's a contraction taking place. But because there's no movement at that get set, if you do it now, on your marks, you're just kneeling up in the blocks, get set, that is an isometric contraction. So you're working hard, muscles are contracting, but there's no movement, therefore no change in length of the muscles. It has to be isometric. As soon as the gun goes off or someone shouts out go, and they push off and extend that leg and start driving through their sprinting technique, that then becomes isotonic, just like the top left. So initially isometric, then as soon as there's movement, it becomes isometric. And the swimming action, similarly, if you're on the starting blocks and holding that fixed position, that's initially isometric. But as soon as you're actually in the water and completing that swimming technique, there's movement in your arms and your legs, that then becomes isotonic. Okay, add all of those into the list that you've got. So you've got a nice comprehensive list, and any that you've had on the list previously that maybe don't fit that set rule, make sure you've purple penned it and edited it so you've got an accurate list. Key rule is isotonic is what? No, isotonic is movement, sorry, and a change in muscle length. Isometric, no movement, no change in muscle length. That's the first part of the work. We then take a look at this. So you've got two different types of isotonic contractions. Isotonic movement and a change in muscle length. The first type of isotonic contraction is what we call a concentric contraction. Make a note of this. Concentric is where the muscle length shortens under tension. So there's movement involved and the muscle length is shortening during the contraction. What you need to do is put down a list of concentric sporting examples. I've put one down in there, so the legs when running. Now you can use some of the same examples that you've had before. Which ones of those examples do you think are concentric? Okay, where the muscle length shortens. Pause the video here, have a go at putting a list together, and we will confirm your answers in a minute. Okay, so for concentric examples, the legs when running, absolutely fine. The arms when pushing up during a press up, that's crucial during the pushing up phase of a press up. That would be a concentric contraction, muscle length shortens. The arms when throwing, it's a concentric contraction. The legs when jumping up, and again, the upwards part of that is crucial. And the arms and legs were swimming, that's a concentric example. Now, I said before that in sport, you've got more isotonic contractions than isometric, and in sport, you will have significantly more concentric contractions than the opposite one, which we're going to look at in a minute, which is eccentric. Okay, most sporting actions are concentric. Key thing with that is that muscle length shortens under tension. Now, the opposite of that is an eccentric muscular contraction. Now, that is where the muscle length increases under tension. This is sometimes confused with people just thinking that the opposite of concentric is shortening and contracting, eccentric must be to do with relaxation. That's not the case. Eccentric is still working, but the muscle length increases under tension. And there's a key rule that we're going to try and establish here that will help you decide during any sporting example whether it's concentric or eccentric. So let's look at the sporting examples first. See if you can think of sporting examples which are eccentric in their contraction. Okay, pause the video here and see if you can make a list. Okay, let's confirm a few here. So I've just thrown them all in there together. The arms when lowering down during a press up, the arms when lowering down during a pull up, the legs when controlling the landing from a jump. Now, if you think about each of those examples, write them down in a list, but then look carefully at them. What's a common feature with each of those? Obviously, they're unique in what they look like, There's a key factor in each example here that makes it eccentric. So the legs, when you're lowering down, the arms, when you're lowering down, arms again, lowering down. The legs, when you're controlling the landing from a jump, tend to bend your knees and lower yourself down as well. Okay? So what's the key rule here? Well, let's look at it carefully. In this example, okay, you've got two images. You can do this now. Stand up. You can do it on the floor, just go to a stairs to really emphasize it. On the edge of the stairs, push up. What movement or joint action is that? So that is plantar flexion, pointing the toes down and away. Yeah, the gastrocnemius here, you can see it contracting. That is plantar flexion of the ankle. The opposite of that is dorsiflexion. You can see the gastrocnemius isn't as obvious there, okay, because it's the muscles that run down the front part of the shin here, tibialis anterior. Normally, however, because it's controlled downward movement, if you look here, he's lowering himself down. This is crucial. Have a think in these examples. What's the joint action taking place in picture A? So we've just established the joint action there is plantar flexion. Which muscles are the agonist and antagonist in that example? Well, they're pushing up. So the agonist must be the gastrocnemius, the antagonist must be the tibialis anterior. And you would normally associate, if you're just sitting down and then bring those toes up towards your knee, that movement or joint action there would just be the opposite. So the tibialis anterior would be the agonist, and the gastrocnemius would be the antagonist. But during eccentric contractions, the agonist is always the opposite of what you'd normally associate with that joint action. Okay, now read that through again carefully, because it's a key rule. And if you get your head around this rule, it will help you answer any questions about muscular contractions, particularly whether you've got to identify if it's concentric or eccentric. So during plantar flexion, the agonist is gastrocnemius, which is what you'd expect. Now, normally dorsiflexion, we would say that the agonist is the tibialis anterior, the opposite. However, in this example, because it's controlled downward movement here, during dorsiflexion, it's an eccentric contraction. So as you go from this position to this position, it's a controlled lowering. That then becomes eccentric. And what it basically means is that the agonist stays the same as what it was before. So the gastrocnemius remains the agonist, but it's now working eccentrically. This is a concentric example where the agonist is the gastrocnemius. This is an eccentric example where the gastrocnemius remains as the agonist, the tibialis anterior remains as the antagonist because it's controlled downward movement. Any sporting example where there's controlled downward movement is eccentric. And in terms of establishing the agonist and the antagonist, it would just be the opposite of what you would normally associate. So this movement, you would normally associate the tibialis anterior being the agonist. Because it's controlled downward movement, it's the opposite. And in this case, it's the gastrocnemius, but it's working eccentrically. So all eccentric contractions involve, I've said it 5 or 6 times there just to emphasize it, 3 keywords. They involve controlled downward movement. If it's not controlled downward movement, it's concentric. If it is controlled downward movement, it's eccentric. And once you've established that it's eccentric, think about what it would normally be, and then it's just the opposite. So same thing. What you've got to do is apply this same rule to other sporting examples. So, for example, this is our next task. We're going to work through this one together, and then I'm going to push it onto you to go through a series of different examples. So the bicep curl. These are the questions that you're going to be faced with. in each example. And then there's one other thing I'm going to tag on the end. What's the joint actions involved? What type of joint is involved in the movement? Which muscles are involved in the movement? Which one of those muscles is the agonist in each phase of the movement? So if you look here, up and then down, 2 phases. So you need to be clear which is the agonist in each phase, and then what's the type of contraction in each phase of movement. Okay, pause the video here and have a go at it for this example, and then we'll explain what the answer is shortly. So in this example, let's go through it. The joint actions. So what type of movements are they? Well, that's flexion and extension. Flexion on the way up, extension on the way down. Decrease in angle of the joint as the weight comes up, and increase in the angle of the joint as the weight is lowered back down. Flexion and extension. What type of joint is working here? Well, it's at the, if you're focusing on the elbow, what type of joint is that? That is the hinge joint. So flexion, extension at the hinge joint. Muscles involved, biceps and triceps. The agonist in each phase of the movement, so which muscle is responsible for the movement in each phase there. On the downward part, you would say it's the triceps, and on the upward part, hold on, horrendous error there. During the bicep curl, clues in the name, Mr. Davis. On the upward part, it's the biceps, but on the downward part, it's also the biceps. Why is that the case? Upwards, we know, is concentric, so clues in the name of bicep curl. Biceps would be the agonist. Why are the biceps also the agonist during that downward phase? It's extension, so you'd normally associate that with triceps at the elbow. What's the key rule? It's controlled downward movement, so it's the opposite of what you'd normally associate with it. Okay, so the biceps are the agonist during the flexion stage on the way up, but they're also the agonist on the way down because it's controlled downward movement. The contraction in each phase of the movement, flexion, God, I've got this all over the place. It's the opposite here, my bad. Okay, it's the concentric, it's the flexion on the way up. And then the eccentric element of it is the extension as you're lowering it back down. Okay, so just to be clear, flexion is concentric, extension is eccentric because it's controlled downward movement. Okay, make sure you've got that written accurately. Don't make the same mistake I did. Okay, the final part of this then, identify the point in the technique where the contraction may become isometric. So think back to, what does isometric mean? Isometric contractions. So there's no movement and no change in muscle length. So if the individual, this was the position here, and they just held it in a set position like that, holding the weight, that then becomes an isometric contraction. So if they weren't lifting it up and down, they just held it in that position, that's when it's isometric. And what does that mean? No movement, no change in muscle length. Okay, so just to be clear on that, the bicep curl, the concentric phase is on the way up. Biceps are the agonist, triceps are the antagonist. On the way down, your biceps are still the agonist because it's an eccentric contraction. An eccentric contraction, a controlled downward movement. Therefore, the biceps, if you do it now, you pick up something, curl it up, and then slowly lower it down, the biceps remain the muscle that are responsible for that movement. You will feel the tension in that muscle. But because it's a controlled downward movement, you can see here, the muscle is lengthening from this position here, where it's quite bunched up together. Here, it's much more stretched out. And then the third element here is if you're just holding it in this set position, muscle stays the same length, there's no movement, you're just holding it there. That is an isometric contraction. No movement, no change in muscle length. What you need to do, look at these 4 examples, go through the same process. For each of them, what the joint actions involved, and remember there's 2 phases to the movement. What are the joint actions? What type of joint is involved? What are the muscles involved? What's the agonist in each phase of the movement? So you've established which of the 2 muscles are involved. One of them will be the agonist and one of them be the antagonist. Be clear about which one is the agonist, which one is the one responsible for the movement, and then what are the contractions involved in each phase of the movement. Once you've done that, is there a point in this movement where it becomes, instead of an isotonic contraction, it becomes an isometric contraction? And try and explain that nice and briefly in your final part of your answer. So pause the video here, try and complete that task with each of the 4 examples given here. If you get to grips with it, see if you can throw in any other examples and go through the same process as well. So try and think of a different sporting movement or sporting technique and go through that process, because on these ones they're quite similar in terms of the joints. You've got 2 different joints that you're looking at here, but if you really want to kind of broaden your thinking on this, then you can think beyond that and try and think of other sporting examples. So away you go with it, and I will go through the answers with you shortly. So the press up, I'll just go through these one at a time, but make sure that your answers reflect what's on here. So the joint action again, at the elbow, flexion and extension. So you're bending and then you're straightening here at the elbow. Type of joint, elbow, hinge joint. Muscles involved, biceps and triceps. Agonist in each phase. So during that downward phase, the triceps are working. If you do a press up now, but do it really slowly, on the way down, you'll feel your triceps kind of burning. That's the contraction. On the way up, the triceps are also the ones responsible for that movement. So on the way up, what type of joint action is that? On the way up, that's extension as you're straightening the arm. So you would expect the triceps to be the agonist there. But on the way down, that's flexion, and you would normally expect flexion at the elbow. The agonist would be the biceps. Why isn't it the biceps? Because it's an eccentric contraction. Why is it an eccentric contraction? Because it's controlled downward movement. Finally, contractions in each phase of the movement. So like I've just said, flexion is eccentric. So on the downward phase there, it's eccentric. And on the upward phase, it's extension. And that extension is concentric. Concentric because it's not controlled downward movement, so it has to be concentric. Make sure your answer reflects that information there and it makes sense to you. If it doesn't, just go back and go over it again so you're clear before we move forward. Kicking a football or a rugby ball in this case, joint action, flexion and extension. Type of joint, the knee, which is the hinge joint. Muscles involved, this time we're looking at the hamstrings and quadriceps. Agonist in each phase of the movement. So the hamstrings, during that flexion phase where they're bending the leg backwards like that, that's flexion at the knee. Hamstrings are responsible for that. So if you put yourself in that position, hold it for a few seconds, you'll feel your hamstrings start to tighten up. Certainly I do. As you move the leg forward to straighten it to kick the ball, that's extension, and the muscles that are responsible for that movement are the quadriceps. Now the contraction in each phase of the movement, flexion is concentric, but also the extension is concentric, because there's no slow controlled downward movement in this example. So they're both concentric. As long as it's not controlled downward movement, i.e. slow and steady movement lowering down, then it's going to be concentric. On this example, you could also factor in, if you were going to go into more detail on it, you could look at, for instance, the ankle and also the hip involved there and kind of go through that process. So what's the joint actions there? What's the type of joint at the ankle and the hip? Which muscles are involved? Which muscles are the agonist and the antagonist? What type of contractions are they? Have a think about that before we move on. Maybe add that into your answer there. Okay, next example. So running. Essentially, it's the same as the previous one. So the movement, flexion and extension. The joint is the knee, muscles, the hamstrings and quadriceps. During that flexion phase, where they're bending the leg backwards, it's the hamstrings. The extension phase, it's the quadriceps. Contractions, flexion is concentric, extension is concentric. It's the same as kicking the football. Essentially, it's the same movements involved. The squat, now this one's slightly different. So a lot of this will be the same because you're still looking at the knee joint. So it's still flexion and extension, still hamstrings and quadriceps. The agonist is the crucial thing. On the way down, that bending, decrease in angle of the joint, that's flexion, it's the quadriceps. Now normally, which muscles would you associate with flexion at the knee? Normally that's the hamstrings. It's during flexion when you're preparing to kick a football and you're bending that leg back, that's flexion, but that's the hamstrings at the agonist. Why is it the quadriceps here? Because it's an eccentric contraction. You're controlling that downward movement. So it's the opposite of what you'd normally associate with it. The extension phase is on the way up. Now, normally you'd associate the quadriceps with being the muscle responsible for that movement. And it's the same here. It's only the controlled downward movement that dictates that because you're slowly lowering your body weight down under control, that instead of being the hamstrings becomes the quadriceps. So the quadriceps are the agonist for both phases of the movement. The contractions involved during flexion is the eccentric. So as you're bending, it's a controlled lowering down. The extension as you're coming up is a concentric contraction. And finally, this one, the pull-ups. So again, flexion extension at the elbow, which is a hinge joint, biceps and triceps. On the way up, that's flexion, you're bending the arms at the elbow, biceps are working. On the way down, as you're straightening, that's extension, straightening the arms, but the biceps are the agonist. Why are the biceps the agonist? Because it's controlled downward movement. So that's the opposite of what you'd normally associate with it. So normally you'd think extension at the elbow, that has to be the triceps. No, because it's controlled downward movement, we know it's the opposite. So in this case, it's the biceps. Again, if you do this example, if you've got something you could pull yourself up on and then slowly lower yourself down, it will be the biceps that you feel working on the way up and on the way down. And the contractions involved in each phase of the movement, flexion on the way up, that's concentric, and then extension on the way down, which is eccentric. It's eccentric because it's controlled downward movement. And what we haven't done for each of these is just look at that extra bit that we said about at what point does any of these become isometric. And essentially, it's at any point where that movement is just held in a stationary position. So if he was to pause there at the top of his pull-up, that would then become isometric. If you were to pause at the bottom of the squat, that then, for that moment of stationary, where there's no change in movement, or there's no movement and there's no change in muscle length, that then becomes isometric. So just make sure that you're clear on that in each of your examples. And then very briefly, let's just look at what you should be clear on by the end of this. And if you're not, make sure you take the time to go back over it. Can you define isotonic muscle contraction? Can you define isometric muscle contraction? Can you define concentric muscle contraction? Can you define eccentric muscle contraction? Can you give sporting examples for all of them? Can you identify the agonist and the antagonist for each of those sporting examples? So essentially, that's what you should have recorded in your notes. As you go over it again, what you want to do is you want to get to the point where you're not having to refer to your notes. And you could essentially explain your answers to each of these questions nice and clearly without having to refer to notes. That is where you want to be at the end of this topic. And finally, can you explain the impact eccentric muscle contractions has on which muscle is the agonist? So essentially, you're explaining eccentric contractions with sporting examples. Why is it eccentric? What's the key rule? Hopefully this presentation will have drummed that into you nice and clearly. If not, go over it again and make sure you're clear before we move on. Okay. Hope to see a good set of notes for this, guys. Any issues, obviously go back over it. And then if you're still confused, please let me know. Okay. All the best, guys. Cheers. Bye-bye.